Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today I'm joined by Paul Bloxham, HSBC's New Zealand and Australia Chief Economist. Paul, thank you for your time.
No problem.
Right, you very famously, nearly 2 years ago, coined the New Zealand economy a rock star economy. This is the obvious question really, is the New Zealand economy still a rock star economy?
Well, we were quite careful. We said that this was back in January of 2014 to say that we thought New Zealand would be the rock star economy of 2014. And really what we were saying at that point in time was that New Zealand would outperform. It would be one of the fastest growing economies in the developed world. As it turned out, actually New Zealand was the fastest growing OECD economy in 2014. And we were hoping that perhaps New Zealand would continue that strong performance into 2015 as well. But as it turns out, things have slowed down a bit. And the thing that slowed down New Zealand's growth this year has been something that's outside of New Zealand's control, and that is a sharp fall in dairy prices and a slowdown in the dairy sector. What we've got in mind for this year, though, as we watch what's going on, is that although things have slowed down relative to last year, and New Zealand's probably likely to be more middle of the pack across the OECD economies rather than the outperformer, we do think New Zealand's still doing okay. Growth is still reasonably robust. We think growth will be about 2.3% this year, and it's being supported by things outside of the dairy sector.
So if you had to call the New Zealand economy, give it a rock star label, in June I read a column that you wrote and you called it the Nirvana. Now Nirvana is a sort of long-standing classic rock band, but Kurt Cobain also did commit suicide. So would you still call us the Nirvana economy?
Oh, look, I think rockstar, the idea of that was to capture the idea that New Zealand was outperforming when you compared it to the rest of the world. And that certainly was the case in 2014. It was the fastest growing economy in the OECD. This year, it's a bit more middle of the pack. But when you think about economies and you think about how they perform, really the challenge is, can the economy absorb whatever the world has to offer, that is, whatever shocks come along, and absorb it well and still continue to grow? And our view is that although dairy prices have come down a long way, and indeed they're about 50% off their peak levels, the New Zealand economy appears to be absorbing that reasonably well, and to still grow at over 2% is still a pretty reasonable performance when you compare it to the rest of the developed world.
Sure, and if we do talk about dairy in a bit more detail, the Global Dairy Trade Auction, which is happening tomorrow morning, what do you expect to see with prices? Do you think they will keep rising?
Well, they certainly have stabilised in the past few auctions, which is a good story. They had fallen a long way to very low levels. We think there could be a little bit more upside to the dairy price yet because they had gotten to such extraordinarily low levels. But we would be surprised if dairy prices got back to the highs that you'd seen 18 months ago, that we're probably not headed back to those sorts of levels anytime soon for a couple of reasons. One is that demand has pulled back a bit. Chinese demand in particular has been softer, but probably more importantly, there's been a large boost to global supply. So it's not just New Zealand that's boosting global supply of dairy at this point in time. Australia is getting into this space. The Europeans much more are providing more global supply of dairy. So it would be surprising if prices got back to those high levels. But if they do stabilise and they do lift a little bit further from here, that should be somewhat supportive of an industry at the moment that is under a fair bit of pressure.
Right, so in terms of other industries or other things keeping our economy afloat, how do you think they're looking, sheep and beef, tourism, these other sorts of things, oil and gas?
Well, things are picking up in other parts of the economy. Our message at the moment is dairy's down, but don't panic. There are other things that drive New Zealand's growth, and there are a couple of key ones that we're pointing to. The first is the construction story still has further to run. Although Canterbury, the rebuild is starting to level out and probably will only be a small contributor to GDP growth this year and will start to level out into 2016, the Auckland construction story has still got a long way to run. Population growth is strong in Auckland and there aren't enough houses, so there is a lot more residential building yet to come, and that we think will be a net support for growth. And then the other factor we think supporting growth is travel services, the tourism industry in particular. In fact, if you look at the numbers and you look at travel services, that includes tourism and education exports, those are set to collectively overtake dairy to be New Zealand's largest export this year. And that's quite a story. There's been quite a sharp pickup in tourism. It's being led by Chinese arrivals in particular. They're up 180% over the past 5 years. Chinese arrivals are about over 300,000 arrivals, up from about 100,000 5 years ago. And that's been a key support for that story. And education exports, education enrolments are starting to pick up as well. So collectively, we think that the tourism story, the construction story, will be supports for growth that will more than offset the weakness we're seeing in the dairy sector and still leave growth at a pretty reasonable pace.
Where do you see migration going? What sorts of patterns do you think we can expect to see? So over the next 10 years, it really has risen sharply in recent times. Where do you see this going?
Well, certainly, the migration story is a cyclical thing to a large degree. And if you step back and try to explain what's been going on, well, migration has picked up very strongly, in part because Australia's growth has slowed. Australia is growing at a below-trend pace at the moment. The mining boom is over, and so people who had moved over, or Kiwis that had moved to Australia to work in the mining boom, have now been moving back to New Zealand. Fewer Kiwis have been leaving New Zealand because New Zealand has been performing better, and so that combination of factors has seen strong inward migration, in fact record levels of inward migration. Now, the Australian economy is continuing this transition. It is continuing to rebalance its growth from a mining-led story to a non-mining-led story, and growth we think will head back towards trend sorts of rates in Australia next year. And that should mean that you'll start to see the level of migration to New Zealand level out. It's at high levels at the moment, at record high levels, but we do think it's getting close to its peak sorts of levels. We don't think it's going to fall dramatically anytime soon, but we do think that it is getting close to its peaks. Now, that inward migration has been a key driver of New Zealand's growth recently, in particular population growth in Auckland, which of course is then leading to a pickup in residential construction in Auckland. And so that's been one of the supports for growth. So with migration rates expected to stay reasonably high, at least over the coming period, we think that that's going to continue to support growth.
What are your thoughts on the Auckland housing bubble? Is this something that concerns you?
It is a bit of a concern. House prices in Auckland are still rising at very rapid rates, and they have been running at high rates for a number of years now. The authorities are obviously trying to slow things down. They can see the risk that's potentially building in the Auckland market by tightening up macro-prudential settings. They've been gradually becoming more aggressive about trying to tighten up those macro-prudential settings. And there is some evidence that it's having a bit of an effect. But of course, at the same time, the RBNZ has been cutting interest rates. So the Auckland housing market is still growing at a rate that's probably unsustainable. If it keeps going at this sort of pace for too long, at some point in time, there will need to be a slowdown or perhaps a correction.
I heard an interview you did, I think it was back in June, and you said that the high Auckland house prices were actually beneficial for the majority of Aucklanders. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that or clarify that, because it's beneficial if you're selling a house, but for the rest of Aucklanders, who aren't in the property market, it really is putting a lot of pressure on them. What are your thoughts around this?
Sure, the owner occupation rate is relatively high. Most people own a house. And that was the point I was making. So most people do benefit from rising house prices because the price of the asset that they own is going up. But of course it has redistributional effects as well. The people who don't own houses and are looking to get into the housing market, obviously it works against them. It makes it more expensive to get into the housing market. But overall it is a benefit. The key thing is getting the right balance. Rising house prices are a sign that the economy is doing well, but house prices shouldn't run well ahead of disposable incomes or nominal income growth in the economy for a sustained period of time, because if that does happen, it's a sign that perhaps it's getting a little bit out of line. And that's what's been going on in Auckland. House prices have been rising a bit faster than incomes for quite some time, and so at some point in time things will slow down, or perhaps they'll slow down more quickly, and that will be a bit more of a challenge at that point.
Paul, you've described the New Zealand's combination of high growth and low inflation as a heavenly combination. What are your thoughts on the Reserve Bank cutting rates and looking to continue doing so later this year?
Well, certainly when you looked at last year's growth performance, you could say growth was running above trend, 3.3% growth. It was the fastest growing economy in the OECD, and at the same time, inflation was very well contained. It was low. Now, with that combination in mind, the RBNZ looked at the economy, much like the rest of the economists looked at the economy and said, inflation will surely pick up. I mean, that's what typically happens. When growth is above trend, it's running quickly, the unemployment rate's falling, typically you get a pickup in inflation. But there were some surprises, and the surprises were on the supply side. A collection of positive supply-side shocks meant that inflation just has not picked up. The first of these factors was, of course, that the currency stayed very high for a long time. The New Zealand dollar was very high. The second of the factors was that oil prices came down. That surprised everyone. Oil prices halved in the second half of last year. And then add to that you had strong inward migration into New Zealand. We talked about that already. And that, of course, held down wage pressures. If strong labour demand was being met by strong labour supply. So the combination of all of those supply factors meant that inflation stayed at very low levels. And so the RBNZ has had to reverse course. It's realised that even though growth was running above trend, it hasn't delivered the sort of inflation it expected, and so they've been cutting interest rates. We think they'll cut again. We think they'll cut before the end of the year back down to 2.5% in order to try and get inflation to lift from here. Now, we do think that the cuts and the fall in the New Zealand dollar will be sufficient to get inflation back to the middle of their target band by the middle of next year. So when I described it as a heavenly combination or a really good thing, it is a good thing to have strong growth and low inflation. The challenge, of course, is inflation has been perhaps a little lower than the RBNZ would have liked, and of course that's meant that they've had to cut interest rates.
Sure. Paul, something else which I'd like to talk about is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Look, I know it's still early days and details are still coming out about this, but what are your initial reactions? Do you think New Zealand is sort of being left in a decent enough position, particularly with what it's come to in regards to dairy?
Look, I think in general the agreement is a positive one. It's the biggest trade agreement we've seen globally since 1994. This is a positive thing. It brings together Japan and the US in particular, which haven't had bilateral agreements before. So this is generally positive. For New Zealand, I think it's going to be positive as well. It will mean greater access in terms of exporting agricultural products, but probably more importantly will be all the various measures that are in the agreement on the services side. So reducing licensing requirements, lining up regulations across countries, things that help to promote services exports, business services in particular. So this should create some opportunities for New Zealand and for Australia, of course, as well. So in general, it looks as though it's going to be a positive agreement. It would have been more helpful, of course, if a couple of more things had been managed in terms of dairy and in terms of meat, but in general, you've got to think that it's still positive.
Sure. All right. Paul, well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I'm Junaid Tibshirani and have been joined today by HSBC's Chief Economist for New Zealand and Australia, Paul Bloxham.